This is All India Radio, Power of Listening. Under this series, tonight we take you on a journey to the world of yet another magnificent facet of the traditional Indian knowledge systems. I am Manoj Mainkar. In the previous 2 episodes of our series, Space Science in Ancient India, we came to know about many fascinating endeavors that mankind has ever recorded, and they were all the contributions of India. We were also enlightened about the enormous contributions of the greatest Indian astronomers like Aryabhatta, Varahamihira, etc., shedding light on how ancient India was the cradle for many of the world's greatest scientific discoveries. In this episode, we shall be focusing on the art and science of the measurement of time in ancient India. The expert on the show is Dr. Abhirup Datta, Professor of Astronomy, Astrophysics and Space Engineering at IIT Indore. In conversation with him is science communicator Dr. Manas Pratim Das of AIR Kolkata. Stay tuned.
Welcome listeners to another episode of Power of Listening. In this series, as you all know, we are focusing on ancient Indian knowledge systems, and through these episodes we are trying to understand how these systems developed and how much informed we are about our ancient heritage. Today we have with us in our studio Dr. Abhirup Datta from IIT Indore. He is a professor in the Department of Astronomy, Astrophysics and Space Engineering. And today we will discuss about several things, among which the first to figure is time measurement. Now we have a clock on the wall, wristwatch, a clock in our cell phone, several very specific type of clocks, and clocks that can measure a fraction of a second very correctly, very accurately. So these are our present understandings. But what was the understanding at that period of time? How did the seers, how did the learned people think about time? How did they measure unit of time? Or what were the units of time prevailing at those periods?
Thank you. So last time we were discussing about the major work of Varahamihira, who actually played a monumental role in assembling 5 different system of knowledge, Pancha Siddhanta, and gave into a single volume of work called Pancha Siddhanta by itself. One of the major Siddhanta which actually was followed and prevailed after Varahamihira was Surya Siddhanta. It went through a couple of few changes, but that is the most prominent thing which we know. Now, the reference of time and its units goes back to Surya Siddhanta. We find there are 2 surprises. We find the unit of time to be less than even 1 second, if we calculate it correctly, the one which was used then. And the bigger unit of time goes even further beyond the age of the universe, which your current understanding currently. So there's 2 surprises left for us at the end of this discussion. That how? Because of course when we talk about unit, we talk about the least precision of our measuring instrument. But the measuring instrument which we can also tell about are not that precise, precision and sophisticated. So that still is a maybe matter of another talk or debate or even a research how this was done. So just to come back to the references of Surya Siddhanta and what we understand from Surya Siddhanta, we basically, the references goes to 11th and 12th slokas of Surya Siddhanta, and we get the references of Gurvakshar. So 10 Gurvakshar is 1 pran, 10 prana is equal to 1 vinadi, 60 vinadi is equal to 1 nadi, and 60 nadi is equal to 1 day. Now 1 day, as we know currently, is consist of 24 hours. Each hour is 60 minutes and each minute has 60 seconds. So our unit of time stops at seconds. Although with our current stopwatches and everything, we can even consider measuring up to milliseconds and even nanoseconds for precision. Okay, atomic clocks have been also obtained. But in those time, you're talking about 500 AD, around that particular period. And if you calculate, so 1 day is 60 nadi, which is equal to 61 nadi is equal to 60 vinadi. So 1 day is equal to 300,000 and 3,600 vinadis. And each of them has 10 prana. So 36,000, prana. And each prana has 10 things. So 33.6 lakhs of Gurvakshar is equal to 1 day. Now that's much finer calculation than 1 second. So obviously the question comes, what was the measurement? How do they measure time up to that precision? But if we find the reference, as I told last time also, that all the texts of this period, whether it is from Aryabhat or Varahamir or Brahmagupta or Bhaskaracharya, they concentrate more on the mathematical calculations, models and predictions of the path of the heavenly bodies across the sky. Very rarely they have spoken about how do they measure those things. Some references of measuring unit of the time has come in context to Varahamid also, but that is related to very unsophisticated, very primitive instrument. Like you have a bowl of water, hemispherical bowl of water, and you put another hemispherical bowl of a lesser diameter, of course, and with some hole at the bottom. And you precision goes in making that hole such that when it comes up, it measures 1 unit of time, maybe 1 hour or so. So that was the precision. So when basically the vessel is filled with water, that considered as some unit of time, whether an hour or more than an hour, that can be calculated based on the size of the vessel. But that won't give me the precision of time, which is this 10 Gurvakshar and all these things. So that is still remains an interesting topic of discussion and maybe research even. How they do this? It just has reference to purely mathematical basis, or do they have some other? How do they measure it? Because we never spoken about milliseconds. Still, we actually measure that particular unit of time. So it's still a bit perplexing, and maybe more discussion and research is required.
Right. When you informed us about the subunits of time, we were thinking, I mean, this information will prod a listener to think about the instruments that were being used.
Correct.
So as you explained that the mathematics ruled supreme, but we don't have enough information on the instruments that were used, at least in the 5th or 6th century AD. Now, at the same time, we would like to ask you that later on, much later on, when we had, say, instrument right in front of our eyes, like the Jantar Mantar, which could give us a unit of time in a very precise manner. So that was something very nice to behold. But do you think that the knowledge has actually come down from the ages of Barahamid and Aryabhat to those ages, to the age of Sawai Jai Singh?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it has to start. Sawai Jai Singh suddenly cannot build those. So we are referring, for listeners who are not aware. So you see this very famous, observatories of the past, mainly built by Raja Sawai Jai Singh too. He built a few of them. One of them, the most famous one, the combined one, is in Delhi, the Delhi Jantar Mantar, popularly called. The actual one is in Jaipur, where he was there. But there are also others in Ujjain, in Varanasi, in I think in Mathura also. So there are a few of them around India, and there are few yantras which are there in all of them, and there are a combination of them. Like there is a one called Samrat yantra, and there, if you look at the most precise one in Jaipur or in Ujjain or even in Delhi, you can measure up to, I think, 1/3 of a minute, up to that precision or more. So you have basically striations, and based on the solar projection and the shadow, you basically measure time. That's very precisely done. There is other instrument like Shanku Jantra, where you basically see the overall, yearly motion of the sun, and mostly useful for the seasons and other things. And there are very other things like Nandi Valai Jantra and various other things were there. But your question is still holds that if this was built by Sawai Jai Singh, who was not exactly a trained astronomer, we cannot say that, but because he's, by the name, he's a ruler, he's a political person, not quite a astronomer, trained astronomer, yeah. So mostly by his, hobby or something prevailed that he wanted to establish these things. The technology, the knowledge definitely was transferred from the previous astronomers, and maybe goes back to Ujjain and the initial astronomers like Varahamir or Brahmagupta, Bhaskara and all these people. In fact, there are some references where they say that although the instruments were not mentioned in detail, one of the reasons can be that the writer did not wanted to disclose the technology or the way to use those instruments in detail. Like, for example, in references to Varahamihira and his calculations, we find use of poles, like basic sticks. We know we can use projection, basic trigonometry to measure distances and its the angles obtained by any star on the location where you're standing. Those were done. How to make calculations with those poles apparently were just restricted to selected pupils of the guru of that time. There's also references of another circular arc-like structure, which is also used. We know how to use a compass, similar things, protector-like thing maybe have evolved at that time. But again, those references, as I said in the first lecture, those references of those detailed instruments were only limited to a one chapter or half a chapter of the expanded books, where the rest of the books talked about mathematics, models, calculations, predictions, and other things. So it is very likely that it may be restricted or limited to specific knowledge so that it may not be replicated. That's a possibility. And we cannot just guess because there is no exact proof of what happened. But I bring it to another thing. As I said, we were very surprised to see that the smallest division of time is less than a second. Like, we never spoke about milliseconds or nanoseconds till we actually came to measure those things. But that's also true. But also true that the system of time laid out in Surya Siddhant also has a role of measuring the biggest unit of time in the current day and age in astronomy is the age of the universe. From the starting of the universe till today, whatever we are. And it is 14.9 billion years based on the current model of the universe, which started from something called Big Bang. But if you go back to the Surya Siddhant, as the day progresses, we spoke about 1 day. Now, 1 day and month are defined because 1 day is basically sun rises, sun sets. So 1 day is defined by that. So you subdivide those. 1 month is basically going from one Purnima or full moon to another full moon. And we have defined 1 month, and 12 months is equal to 1 year because that's time sun takes to go back to the position. Those were defined. Now what happens is after that, there are concepts called Chaturyug, which is around 12,000 times 360 years. Those concepts exist. Then talks about 1 Manyantar is equal to 71 Chaturyug. Those exist. And then 1 Kalpa is equal to 14 Manyantar. Now, at this stage, if you go back to the years, so 1 Kalpa is equal to 4.32 billion years. Okay, already. And this 4.32 factor always comes in the discussion starting from Vedanga Jyotisha till today, and people will adventure why this 4.32 factor is there. But it's very easy to understand. So, in Surya Siddhanta, there is also concept of age of Brahma, which is humongously large, which is much thousands and 10,000 times larger than the concept, the age of the universe, which we talk about today. Now, you can ask, as you asked the question very rightfully, that how do you talk about a unit of the time which you cannot measure? Or how do you make a model of unit of time which you can measure? Similarly, what is the use of such a large time scale which is beyond the age of the universe?
I would rephrase this question like this. Did this large units of time had any relation with any physical event or anything, be it the age of the universe or anything else, and which made it more meaningful? Was it there?
In Indian mythology, there are references of Yuga and all these things. But scientifically speaking, talking about such a large age of like 1 age of Brahma is, already 4.32 billion years is quite a large amount of time, like the beginning of solar system. Okay, we talk about that is, you can count like that. So already you're talking about things which is beyond the starting of the human civilizations by a lot of margin. So that's still in very interesting discourse that we should understand more. What was the need of such a huge amount of time? But of course, amounts of time like few years, tens of years or hundreds of years is definitely required because sometimes celestial conjunctions happen over large amount of time. Okay, like these transits of Venus or Mercury, which again comes again and again back in texts of all these people like Aryabhatiya or Varahamihira's Pancha Siddhanta, Surya Siddhanta, then even followed up by Brahmagupta's Sputa Siddhanta. All these major events come because astronomers use those events and the timings to refine their calculations, their understanding of how these heavenly bodies, the planets or stars, rotate in the celestial sphere, which we discussed in great details last time.
Listeners, we are in another episode of Power of Listening, and in the company of Dr. Abhirup Datta, professor at IIT Indore, I feel like an explorer, or more correctly, a detective who is trying to understand why in the 5th century AD, or might be a little later, the seers, the scientists of those time, piled time over time or divided time into such small units. Why did they do that? What was their purpose? What was the requirement? We haven't reached to a firm answer yet, but we are still trying to understand, as Dr. Abhirup Datta is explaining in his own way. Our next question would be, did the occultation phenomenon, the celestial phenomenon, play any part, like say the transit of Venus or the transit of Mercury? Did those play any part in the calculation of these things?
Yeah, so basically, as you know, the transit of Venus happens not so frequently. So, whereas transit of Mercury happens, and these are all happening because planets are rotating, revolving around the sun. But they are revolving around the sun in different orbits. The orbit's eccentricity or the deviation of the orbits from the circular orbit is different for each of the planets around the sun. Not only that, as I said last time, that moon revolves around the earth in a plane which is different from the plane where the earth revolves around the sun. So if earth revolves around the sun, that plane is called ecliptic. Then the moon and the moon's rotation plane around the earth is tilted to that ecliptic.
Almost 5 degrees.
5 degrees, yeah. So those creates a little bit of variation because the projections are different. Similarly, the plane where Mercury is revolving around the sun is a little bit different from the earth and so on and so forth. So when this junction of what is transit of Venus and Mercury? Let's first talk about that. So basically, whenever Mercury and Venus or anything which is coming between us and the sun, so by accordance only Mercury and Venus can come. Nothing else can come because everything is beyond us. So sun, cannot come between us and the sun. Because we are the third. Mars is beyond us. So only Mercury and Venus can transit, and we can see those phenomena as a black dot across the corona of the sun.
That creates a wonderful spectacle, and these days
correct.
People look up to the sky to
Yeah,
watch
these
those.
days you have these filters and other things you can directly look into the sun. Otherwise it was impossible, and you can only see in the telescope. So great progress overall, and a fascinating field of science of astronomy. So what happens is this, because of these events of transit of Venus, Mercury, did not happen every day or every year or even every decade. So predicting when this will happen next is an interesting challenge, as well interesting amount of satisfaction for those who can actually do it.
It means they discovered that there was a pattern to it.
There's a pattern
The
to it,
recurrence
exactly.
of these things.
Recurrence of these things. You can talk about this heliocentric system, that Earth is not at the center of everything, and Sun was at the center and Earth was rotating. Those old thoughts were debunked, and more and more happening, because we are all these relative motions, even retrograde motion of planets, all these things were known, were calculated. So we see all of them, they affect the calculation of these motions of the bodies, angular velocities of different planets. And there, I think, not that every time these ancient astronomers were always right to the precision which we know today, but the limitation is because of their nature of the instruments or the data available to them at that particular time. Because when you're looking at a projection, you can definitely make a mistake by few degrees or few arcs of minutes at least,
Right.
here and there, if you're just using poles and hand or fingers and some primitive equipments. You are bound to make creep in errors in your calculations. So I would not say mistakes or errors, but refinement of their results have happened with more sophisticated instruments, more precise data measurements, and which has led to a finer thing. It was understood at the time that all the planets were rotating with the average same angular velocity, which is not exactly correct.
So at that point of time, they didn't have the benefit of those precision instruments that we have today. But as you said, even using the fingers of your palm, even using the fingers of your hand, you can actually determine how much path heavenly body is traversing and what is the angle being made between the two during travel. All these simple things gave them a knowledge, or we might rephrase it saying that they acquired the knowledge by careful observation and calculation. And most importantly, the way they presented their knowledge was exciting, because they didn't just write down in today's notation. They created slokas, the slokas that held the knowledge in, as we might understand it like this, in cryptic form. So one who knows the language, one who knows how to interpret it, how to read it properly, can only decipher the meaning of the slokas.
I mean, in fact, in the first lecture I spoke about Aryabhatiya. There is one slok which has condensed the entire formulation of sine tables.
Right.
So the entire books which we used to use during our examination time, now calculators are allowed and other things are there. So I think at the time you have to go to log tables, sine tables. So you understand the entire how to form the sine table, not exactly the values, but the methodology how to create a table was within one slok.
Just a couple of lines gave actually the series, the sine hyperbole series.
Correct, exactly. So this is a data mining at its premium form in some sense. So that's very beautiful, yeah.
So as we delve deep into these things, into the works of Aryabhat, Varahamihir, Brahmagupta, we start understanding the attainment of knowledge, the achievements, which even looking back today, we are astonished to. Actually, we are surprised to see that such knowledge could be attained with such simple means. Dr. Datta, I would also like to ask you whether these three figures, Aryabhat, Varahamihir, Brahmagupta, who are not strictly speaking contemporaries, a few years separates them, but still, did they exchange their knowledge in some way or the other? Was there any exchange taking place?
There is no reference so Aryabhat definitely went to the famous Nalanda University, we all know. And the other two which we are discussing, the mainly Varahamihira and Brahmagupta, of course they were in Ujjain. So yes, maybe some exchanges between them may have happened, because they're not, but still not directly, because they're over 100 years apart.
It is agreed that Brahmagupta was born after the passing away of Varahamihira.
Right, correct. If you see that the direct transfer between Aryabhat and Brahmagupta, because the methodology of how we define in Indian traditions beginning of the day is mostly not at the midnight, but that is from the beginning of the dawn.
Usha.
So Usha, yeah. It's called from Udaya, basically. There's a system which starts from the Udaya. But there is another system, which again I mentioned briefly in my talk about Aryabhat, that there was a Ardharatrika system also. That means the day can also begin from the midnight. And unfortunately, the texts where those were discussed by Aryabhat is missing today, in today's day and age. But some hints and the basic principles can be found in Brahmasput Siddhanta by Brahmagupta. Both were proponents of this Ardharatrika system as well. So it's again misunderstanding that maybe it is easy to follow the one which is starting at Usha, but Indian astronomers also acknowledged the system where they can begin from the midnight also. So this 12 hours to midnight, that is not just simply a foreign concept. It's also in our ancient traditions. Only the preferred one is being followed today, which is the starting from Usha or Udaya, and the other one is not followed that much.
Aryabhat, Varahamihir, Brahmagupta, they belong to an area of the present India, which was mostly eastern and middle of India.
Yeah.
And we also feel curious to know whether there was an exchange between other people doing such type of mathematics in other zones of the Indian
land. If we take this series forward, the next major stalwart who comes is Bhaskara 1, then Bhaskara 2, Aryabhat 2 also comes in between. So Bhaskara 2, definitely Lilavati, all the fantastic texts. They have somehow they have a linkage with Ujjain and nearabouts. So there is possibility that they either exchanged directly or indirectly through so maybe there was people people, there is a reference to somebody called Utpala in Varahamir's text. Somebody who commenting on Varahamir's text may have written something and that has translated. So there is a lot of wealth of knowledge in all these books, and people should be encouraged to read and figure out. But again, and the advantage also and the problem, same time, they're all in shlokas form. So somebody has to understand and interpret and write commentary when people can decipher what is going on.
So, Dr. Dutt, today's discussion specifically regarding the measurement of time or the unit of time as it happened during the 5th or 6th century AD in our country.
So I think there is reference that it appears that the knowledge of much finer units of time as well as much larger unit of time exist in Surya Siddhant. But Surya Siddhant also is not just started from Varahamir. He refined and went forward. So it was basically culminating knowledge of the past and formulating something which can be followed. So maybe these concepts of very huge, large time scales came from the Vedanga, Jyotisha, or maybe even before that. But my curiosity still will remain when I will keep understanding what about this finer time, because that's interesting, because now we know how to measure times which are less than milliseconds and all this thing now. So how did they understood that? Was there any other method they used or something they used to measure? That would be very interesting to know. And as you said, Indian knowledge system, that may be a reason why people should start or continue researching on this particular area.
One thing, of course, could be the precision of the astronomical events, particularly when it occurred, or the relative position, how to find out that the subunits of time or the very small units of time could have helped at that point of time to understand these things. So as we conclude, we are again moving into another domain where the ancient Indian knowledge system beckons us to research more, to study more, so that we understand our heritage, understand our country, understand our development of the knowledge system. Thank you, Dr. Abhirab Dutta, for coming to our studios and speaking on these important topics. And with that, we conclude today's episode of Power of Listening. Till we meet again, goodbye.
Measurement of time in ancient India. You heard this episode of our all-new series on traditional Indian knowledge systems, Power of Listening. The expert on the show was Dr. Abhirab Dutta, Professor of Astronomy, Astrophysics and Space Engineering at IIT Indore. In conversation with him was Dr. Manas Pratim Das. This series has been conceptualized by Shashi Shekhar Vempati, CEO Prasar Bharati, and produced by Dr. Manas Pratim Das and Vinod Kumar. Special thanks to AIR Kolkata, Amol Parth and Randhir Thakur for their contributions. This episode is also available on our official YouTube channel, Akashvani AIR. We shall be back next week, same time, same frequencies. This is Manoj Mindkar signing off from Delhi. Bye for now.